And I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes. Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves. Consistent, fair application of law is in itself a good and moral thing, and that protects the weak.
These comments sparked a vivid response from many ecclesial communities and theologians. What did they have to say about the former Attorney General's comments? I'm Chicago Schuler, and we'll cover this and more on today's Pauline briefing. My goal today isn't to sway you one way or another, but to present you with context and how different faith communities and other scholars responded to a specific Pauline interpretation by a person of authority in a secular government. And then I will leave you with a question to take away and ponder, and possibly discuss with others.
To discuss some concerns raised by our church friends about separation of families. Many of the criticisms raised in recent days are not fair, not logical, and some are contrary to plain law.
When Sessions says church friends, he is really responding to criticism from the USCCB and Southern Baptist Convention, who were criticizing new rules and regulations regarding asylum and the family separation policy. These same people had some choice words, but first, let's dig into the history here. The U.S. has what you would say a shaky history with the use of Romans 13. We go way back to before the Constitution was written. The Revolutionary War. Loyalists used Romans 13 to support their cause to perhaps prevent the Christians who were rebelling against the king. At the time, they would have read, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers." Further on in the passages, "The powers that be are ordained of God." Sounds very similar to how Sessions put together his own argument without directly quoting the scripture. What might come to a shock is that the revolutionaries used the verse in their favor as well. The historian James Bird argued that the American revolutionaries disagreed with loyalists that Romans 13 requires unconditional obedience. Protestant ministers of the time would probably remember John Calvin's words well to resist kings when they tyrannize and insult over the humbler of the people, end quote. We now head all the way to 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act gets passed, and those abolitionists against the bill bring up the same argument that the law was opposed to the divine law, thus should be objected to. Those in support of the law would continue to even use Paul's words further on in Romans 13 against them, saying that their insubordination would cause divine vengeance upon their supposed evil deeds. Other ministers during the time period offered other arguments as well. Asa Donaldson said, "The scriptures everywhere treat the worst of human governments as better than anarchy," end quote. David Walker identified Romans 13 and all of Romans with the central message of the Exodus narrative of being set free from an oppressor. And Maria Stewart said this, "You may kill, tyrannize, and oppress as much as you choose until our cry shall come up before the throne of God." End quote. Now, how have ministers and other denominations responded to Jeff Sessions' comments from just several years ago? Since I am Catholic, let's begin with the Catholic response. Cardinal DiNardo seemed to be on the same line as those abolitionists in opposing the morality of the action that the administration was taking, and not the citation of Romans 13. Catherine Jean Lopez, a conservative columnist, wrote for the Catholic publication Our Sunday Visitor. She pointed out the larger context of the law of love that surrounds the rest of that specific verse that Sessions quoted. Her hope was that these verses should be challenging us, but that, hopefully, as she puts it, will help us to reverse some of the cruelty in the current administration. Finally, Stephen Colbert, a famous TV show host who was raised Catholic, had this to say about Sessions' comments.
And he was joking. But I will give Sessions this. That is what Romans 13:1 says. Okay, you got to have laws. But if he just read a little bit further into Romans 13:10, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. But I'm not surprised.
Now to evangelicals. When I refer to evangelical, I am speaking of those Protestants, non-denominational pastors, televangelists, and individuals who write in Christian circles. I'm not totally surprised by the tossed bag that is the response from evangelicals because of how loose of a term it really is to describe such a vast array of denominations. But let's get into it. Franklin Graham, a famous televangelist, again called the policy disgraceful, not noting anything about Sessions' use of Scripture. The Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution calling for immigration reform that maintains priority of family unity and said that Sessions' use was unfair. David Brody, who writes as a political correspondent, was in favor of Sessions' use of Romans 13 and said that it was correct to use Scripture in this way. Lastly, Johnny Moore, who is an influential evangelical advisor to Trump at the time, stated that what the Attorney General was doing was proof texting. This is where people use a small Bible passage to just prove their point. And Moore said further, while Sessions may take the Bible seriously, in this situation he has demonstrated he is no theologian. End quote. So what were the theologians saying? This is important to look at because ministers and correspondents don't always spend time looking into the depth and complexity that theologians have the time and willingness to. Let's highlight what two theologians had to say about Sessions' use of Scripture. Margaret Mitchell, in the beginning of her in-depth article, really wrote about the translation problem with the use of governing authorities versus power or powers, which she says is the proper use. So she's arguing that Sessions is misusing and misunderstanding what Paul meant, and using the verse to defend the law when Paul really wanted to highlight the power that those with divine authority have. She wraps it up with ultimately saying that Sessions is wrong in his own interpretation for defending this specific law, but that we should still be paying taxes. Lynn Cohick gives a larger picture of the historical context of Romans, saying that most of what we're seeing is Paul giving instructions to those in Rome before he goes there so that the church survives. Lynn had this to say in conclusion: you don't follow the government at all costs. That's not what Paul was saying. End quote. Given all of this information, one question still lingers. Should we be using Scripture to defend laws, policies, and actions of our governing authorities? Especially since America has a staunch backing of the separation of church and state.